A global crisis needs global leadership. For most of the past 75 years, that leader has been America. No longer.
World leaders held an online summit today pledging billions to develop a coronavirus vaccine. Notably absent from the meeting were any officials from the Trump administration.
I'm instructing my administration to halt funding of the World Health Organization.
America's retreat has left a vacuum at the top.
Every time that America steps back, that's an opportunity for China to step forward and present itself as the champion of the world order.
Has China spotted an opportunity to steal a march on America and use the soft power of global diplomacy to hasten its rise as the world's top power?
There's one thing we must learn. It's one world. It's a world in which we must all get along. And it's my opinion that this great republic ought to lead the way.
As the Second World War drew to an end, plans were put in place to keep the peace. The United Nations and other newly created institutions would form the backbone of a rules-based world order. And America was the chief architect and leader.
The United Nations have been working for 8 weeks to produce a charter on which the future of world peace will depend.
Since its creation in 1945, the membership of the UN has grown from 51 countries to 193. Its activities and those of its specialized agencies span almost every aspect of life.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
But after successive presidents committed to leading and shaping the world, President Trump has pulled America in a very different direction.
The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations.
Under Donald Trump's presidency, America has been a quitter of international arrangements and institutions.
As well as withdrawing funding for the World Health Organization, a UN agency, President Trump has pulled America out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, the nuclear deal with Iran, and he abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a giant trade agreement that was close to completion.
I think this is all part of the America First idea. There's a long history of America fearing being held down by smaller powers, but it's taken a particularly strong form under Donald Trump.
You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist.
America is so central to an order that has really stood the world in good stead for 75 years. If America withdraws, everybody else is extremely worried about what will maintain this order in its absence and whether the rules of the game are actually going to be adhered to in future.
The country that has stepped into the void left by America is China.
China is becoming more and more powerful on the economic front, technologically, and increasingly geopolitically as well.
Over the past 2 decades, China's contribution to the UN's regular budget has increased from 1% to 12%, while America's has remained the same. China has been methodically increasing its influence in existing institutions, not least the UN. Chinese nationals now head 4 of the UN's 15 specialized agencies. Americans lead just 1.
China has become, in recent years, increasingly assertive in the way that it pushes its interests. It's not afraid anymore to use quite strong-arm tactics. It's not afraid to use its veto in the Security Council.
Security Council vetoes can tell us a lot about the balance of power in the UN. During the Cold War, America used its veto regularly, but in the past decade, it's used it just 3 times. China, on the other hand, has increased its use. But the country exercising its veto power most in recent years is Russia.
There does seem to be an alliance of convenience between China and Russia. Both share an interest in not having Western countries become too busybody in their human rights, for example, to be able to act uninhibitedly in their rather authoritarian ways. Whether over the long term that's sustainable is debatable, because Russia is, after all, a declining power compared with China, which is a rising power, and Russia may come to find its embrace of China distinctly uncomfortable.
In March 2018, France proposed that the UN Security Council heard a briefing on human rights abuses in Syria. But Russia and China opposed the session.
The provisional agenda has not been adopted, it having failed to obtain the required number of votes. The meeting is adjourned.
China managed to prevent that by lobbying very hard with Ivory Coast, former French colony, which switched sides at the last moment. And those sort of little incidents are wake-up calls for the West that China's influence is really starting to be felt.
What's more, Chinese officials have been inserting favoured Chinese wording into UN documents.
Phrases like win-win cooperation, phrases that refer to the Belt and Road, phrases that take a rather Chinese view, if you like, of human rights. Cumulatively, it can have the effect of creating a Chinese-friendly environment for these multinational institutions.
China has also been building channels of influence outside the institutions that America designed. It has set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which encroaches on the World Bank's territory, and created the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, an 8-member group that includes Russia, India, and Pakistan.
It's not obvious that China actually wants to usurp America's role in the sense of taking on wider responsibilities for the global order, but it certainly wants to make the world safer for Chinese expansion.
This has worried those in the West, not least because of China's attitude towards human rights.
If China does continue its rise and the West retreats, then I think human rights would be in trouble. And that one of the criticisms of the Secretary General is that he hasn't put human rights front and centre and defended them as prominently as he might have done.
You can watch Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, responding to this and other questions The Economist put to him by clicking on the link above. There has been some pushback from America. In January, the State Department appointed a senior diplomat, Mark Lambert, to counter the so-called malign influence of China and others at the UN. But there is a sense that America is perhaps no longer as dependable as it once was.
You hear talk of countries getting together to try and keep this rules-based liberal order going. It's not easy to do this without the real impetus that comes from a power with the size and the weight that America can put behind it. But smaller efforts at least can make some difference.
COVID-19 has shown that the biggest problems cry out for international efforts. Climate change is a challenge that no country can tackle alone. The same is true for organised crime and cybercrime. A new president in the White House might give America a renewed interest in looking outward again. But the UN and other global bodies also need to reform. Their 75-year-old structures are not designed for a 21st century world.
Perhaps it will take something of a crisis to make it happen and to give countries the push they need to modernise the institutions.
The coronavirus pandemic has hijacked the global agenda. It also presents an opportunity. The upheaval could spur countries into strengthening the liberal world order. But if America fails to reassert its global commitments, China's diplomatic power will continue to grow.
I've written a special report about the United Nations 75 years after its founding and how it's struggling to adjust to changes in world power, especially the relationship between America and China. You can read it by clicking the link opposite. Thank you for watching.